The main version that runs through this entire film appeared to me a long time ago. Only the Great Pyramid did not fit into it. Because it does not fit the general rule within this version. It is an exception to this rule. But when I realized what made it exceptional, the Cheops pyramid also fit into the general row with the other pyramids. It was an engineering experiment in everything, including. In general, let me first voice my version. There was water inside the pyramids. The pyramids were filled with water. It was water that was the active agent that provided the dynamics inside the pyramids. Water is an elastic medium in which the speed of wave propagation and the attenuation period are much greater than in air. And in this environment, inside the pyramids, a correlation of wave quantities appears where it was not there before. I will leave some interesting calculations for the end of the film, as well as the Great Pyramid. To maintain consistency. Which pyramids are usually considered great? The pyramid in Mihdam, 2 pyramids in Dahshur, the Red and the Bent. And 3 on the Giza Plateau, Menkaure, Khafre, and Cheops. This will not be another review of the pyramids in the usual way. In this film, I want to focus on the details that confirm or at least indicate that there was water inside the pyramids. And here is the first detail that unites all the pyramids. This is the same general rule that I have already mentioned. The entrance to the pyramid is located slightly above the highest point of the interior. That is, according to the rules of connecting vessels, when filling the pyramid with water from the entry point, all the interior rooms are guaranteed to be filled to the end. In this definition, the key word is a little. The entry points are located higher, exactly a little. Exactly enough to meet this condition. This is easy to check. Although the main pyramids in section are freely available on the internet. It is enough to look at any image to see this. But there is an exception to this rule, it is the Pyramid of Cheops. With which I began, and with which I will end. And now. The Mihdam Pyramid. It shows that through the main entrance and the main corridor, all the interior rooms were completely filled with water. Water was also pumped out. This niche in the floor at the end of the horizontal corridor could have been left for this purpose. A hose sleeve lowered into it ended up at the lowest point in order to completely pump out the water. The purpose of this shaft in the descending corridor remains unclear. Note that the pyramid in Mihdam has 2 antechambers, which are located together with the main chamber along the north-south axis, and are spread apart along the west-east axis. This element balanced the vibration of the entire complex along this axis. Obviously chosen by the builders as the main direction of vibrations, which corresponds to the propagation of waves inside the pyramid. Exactly above them there are, as it were, their continuations, with a stepped vault, you can clearly see it here. And the second corridor goes parallel from above, leading from nowhere to the antechambers or vice versa from the antechambers to nowhere. This seemingly incomprehensible unit is easily explained if we make one assumption. 2 antechambers and an upper short corridor were made before the construction of the pyramid, with the simple purpose of testing the work on the test unit. That is, the same test corridor as on the Giza Plateau. Only later it was sewn into the pyramid structure. The proof is simple, look where this corridor ends. This is the ground level. Through this entrance, the prototype was filled with water, artificially created oscillations and checked at what frequency they would be picked up by the 2 antechambers. Based on the test results, the rest of the internal rooms were laid out and covered with a pyramid. This engineering move, with a test section inside, was used by the builders in other pyramids. I will show you. The next pyramid is red. In my opinion, the most improved Mihdam. As you can see, the main condition is met. The entrance is slightly higher than the highest point. Absolutely enough to completely fill the internal rooms. At the end of the descending corridor, where it turns into a horizontal one, there is a niche in the floor. Judging by the way the blocks in this niche were processed, it can be concluded that it was made during the construction of the pyramid, and not by robbers later. In my opinion, this niche was intended for pumping out water. A hose or pump lowered into it ended up at the lowest point of the system and completely removed the water from it. A similar niche on the floor of the first chamber is a later destruction of the floor by robbers. The lower two chambers are located along the north-south axis and are shifted in different directions relative to each other. The first to the east, the second to the west. Thus, when vibrating, they balanced each other. The third upper chamber is located along the west-east axis and was obviously included in the design of the pyramid to set the correct vibration frequency along the north-south axis. Unlike the Mitam pyramid, where the vibration frequency along this axis was not specifically set. They probably hoped that it would work out this way, but it did not work out as desired. For this reason, a third chamber was added to the red one as a resonator of the required frequency along the north-south axis. The largest blocks are installed at the entrance and exit of the first chamber. This indicates that the main load was assumed along the west-east axis. That is, the main vibration. That is why the narrowing of the chamber to the top occurs along this axis. To dampen surface waves and increase the quality factor of the resonator. At the same time, the length of the chamber along the north-south axis remains unchanged. Probably, the vibration along this axis was not the main one and the wavelength was not artificially reduced. I specifically draw attention to this point, because in the next pyramid, the vaulted ceiling reduces the size of the chambers along both axes. This may be the result of errors made in the previous pyramids, the red and Mitam. The next pyramid is the bent pyramid. I will dwell on it a little longer. This is the first attempt to make two systems in one pyramid. The first, but not the last. Two systems that could work both together and independently. You see that both entrances, the northern and western ones, are located a little higher, but high enough to fill the interior spaces completely with water. Here is the lower system. Here is the upper one. The emergency passage between them was punched later. I will show the reasons. Now I want to dwell on some details. The step on the ceiling near the northern entrance could have been used to support the hose through which water was poured. And this hole in the wall was used as a retainer for this hose. After all, no one has seen the door suggested by Flinders Petrie and no one knows where it is. The stepped expansion of the corridor to the exit is explained simply. They created additional space for air to escape in order to avoid an airlock. The so-called chimney, a vertical shaft, is located exactly in the center of the pyramid and was an element of the centering of the two systems. The vibration of which must be necessarily balanced relative to the center of the pyramid. To avoid skewing and, as a consequence, destruction. Therefore, it was decided to make the central reference point in the form of a vertical shaft. Moreover, it was stabilized by two opposite extensions, of which the upper one is directed to the west, and the lower one to the east, i.e. along the main axis of vibration. The connection of the vertical shaft with the lower system is also clear, it had to be filled with water. The lower part of this shaft remains unclear, because when pumping out water, it remains flooded to the level of the chamber floor. But there is a nuance, this appendix, if I may say so. Perhaps this structure is unfinished and according to the plan there should be a jumper connecting the antechamber with the shaft. Here you can see it better. In this case, through the sleeve lowered to the bottom of the antechamber, it was freely possible to pump out water from the entire system. But for some reason, the builders did not bring this jumper to the shaft. Perhaps because it is a rock formation, perhaps they were pressed for time, or perhaps they decided, well, let the water stay there. In any case, this version explains where this niche came from. The upper window into the shaft can also be explained. It is an additional channel for air to escape when filling with water, to avoid an airlock. In the 19th century, when John Perring entered the upper horizontal corridor between the two portcullises through a connecting passage, the western one, closest to the exit, was closed and sealed with mortar around the perimeter. The upper right corner was broken through. He managed to crawl through it and discovered that the portcullis on the other side was also fixed with mortar. The western corridor, which went behind it, was littered with stones. The entrance to it was closed with a stone block like a cork. Flinders Petrie discovered this when he reached it. Therefore, the western entrance was not visible from the outside. It seems as if the upper system was mothballed. Look, the portcullis was fixed with mortar, i.e. made it immobile, filled the entire descending corridor with stone and inserted a plug. Triple protection. Obviously, they wanted to seal the upper system. This fact logically fits into the version with water. The western portcullis was triggered by vibration, dropped and blocked the passage. It is necessary to remove water from the upper system. How to do this? It is clear before the portcullis, through the entrance. And behind it? There is only one way: pump it out through the lower one. To do this, remove water from the lower system, punch a passage and drain water from the upper one through it. Then fix the portcullis with a solution and seal the western entrance. And the portcullis itself was punched much later. In the horizontal corridor between the portcullis, a vertical shaft was discovered, which is not in Perring's drawings. It is convenient for pumping out water with open portcullis. This is the lowest point in the upper system. At the end of the descending corridor, another drain niche is provided for pumping out water with the closed portcullis. It should be noted that the floor of the horizontal corridor of the upper system is a couple of meters higher than the highest point of the lower system. Therefore, when the lower one is completely filled, the upper one remains without water even with a connecting passage. It seems that this option was foreseen by the builders in advance. It should be noted that the party scenes were located on different sides of the corridor line. One to the north and closed in the southern direction, the other to the south and closed accordingly in the northern direction. This technical point provided for the corridor to be closed if the correct vibration was disrupted from any side. In the mid-20th century, Egyptian archaeologist Abdul Salam Hussein examined the bent pyramid and discovered a hidden room under the floor in the upper chamber. He called it a closed box. It was a completely isolated room with wooden spacers. The floor of this hidden room was at the same level as the corridor. It turns out that this hidden space is part of the chamber, but the builders deliberately isolated it by covering it with a false floor. It is logical to assume that there was no water there. Otherwise, why isolate it? In my opinion, this is the first attempt to introduce a master resonator into the design, which generated a reference frequency, to which the chamber was then tuned. A sarcophagus, to put it simply. Only not portable, but stationary. And the spacers were needed to ensure the safety of its dimensions. There is a 23 cm shift inside the descending corridor of the lower system. This deformation occurred due to a violation of the correct vibration of the pyramid, as a result of which the corridor changed its angle of inclination. In fact, it broke. Here you can clearly see the crack. A similar 5 cm shift is also in the western corridor of the upper system, which is a consequence of the same reason: excessive vibration. John Perring noted that the lower chamber and the antechamber were half filled with pieces of blocks and stone chips. Most likely, this is the result of laying a passage between the lower and upper chambers. But, the very fact that this garbage was not removed, and it continued to occupy half of the rooms, is indicative. There can be no wave resonance in such conditions. Most likely, after the emergency pumping of water from the upper system, the lower one was no longer filled. I can even make a bolder assumption. The lower one was not filled at all. In this case, it becomes clear why the builders did not complete the jumper between the antechamber and the vertical shaft. And this can explain the preserved cladding in the lower part of the pyramid. We can conclude that despite all the beauty of this pyramid, the centering and the security system that appeared in the form of party coulisses, the experiment with two systems failed. But as I said above, it was not the only one. There is another pyramid in Dahshur, the Black or Amenemhat III. It is completely destroyed. And many Egyptologists doubt that it is a pyramid at all. And of course, no one considers it to be great. But I cannot pass it by, because I believe that it was the second experiment of two systems working under one dome. A bold experiment, and also unsuccessful, unfortunately. But that does not make it less interesting. Now the Black Pyramid is mostly closed to visitors and remains without the attention it deserves. In my opinion, in vain. Look at what it looks like inside. Apart from the Cheops Pyramid, this is the most complex system of rooms. Look how many elements are collected here. 3 chambers with sarcophagi. 3 pairs of resonator chambers. All chambers have a new element, an arched ceiling, instead of a vaulted stepped one like in the red and bent. And two entrances, from the western and eastern sides. Unlike the other pyramids, where the entrance is from the north. That is, the experiment was in everything. By the location of the entrances, by the number of sarcophagi that set the desired frequency, and paired resonator chambers that balanced the vibration. Even in a small sarcophagus found in this place, an experiment is visible. Here it is. The interior spaces are high enough to move comfortably without bending, but not all of them. The eastern descending corridor has steps inside the ramp, along which they probably lowered the facing blocks and raised the excavated rock. Perhaps the western entrance has the same thing, but it is filled in and it is impossible to check. Although it is unlikely. Look how well made the passages to the right of the large chamber look. By the way, this node with a descent from it to a lower level was later used in the Pyramid of Mykerinos. And what does the corridor look like that leads from the lower antechamber further? An obvious difference in size. And in the quality of the passages. In addition, the sarcophagus in this chamber is larger than the other two and has free access. In these two chambers, the sarcophagi are blocked and it is not so easy to approach them. Sarcophagi of different sizes have different resonant frequencies. In a single resonant circuit, this does not make sense. They will work in dissonance with respect to each other. Chambers blocked with blocks generally lose their volume and cease to be resonators. From the point of view of wave mechanics, this is an attempt to combine the incompatible. Some kind of testing ground, an experimental laboratory. But this idea is interesting. Let's consider it. We have not one system in front of us, but two. After the failure in the bent pyramid, the builders decided to test the two systems again. But this time, rationally spending time and material. Without risking the entire pyramid. They built one solid, high-quality system with the correct geometry, with 3 pairs of resonator chambers, and a chamber with a sarcophagus that sets the desired frequency. With a convenient ramp and steps, i.e. with all the conditions for comfortable work. They fill it with water and test. In many places there were traces of water. Later they decided to add another system. They made it, so to speak, in a hurry. With minimal quality and dimensions, just to squeeze through. And they connected it to the first system. The junctions are visible. One is below the large chamber. Here it is. And the second one is right after the descent into the horizontal corridor on the left, now filled with new masonry. Although no one can say how new it is. The corridor going off to the side is visible through the wooden flooring. Here it is clearly visible during the reconstruction. Another option is possible. Both systems were made at once, but they were tested separately and then connected. But in this case it is difficult to explain such an obvious difference in quality. The second system could also work autonomously, because it has everything. 2 resonator chambers, 2 prechambers and 2 master sarcophagi tuned to the same frequency, plus a whole set of other elements. I don't know why they were connected into a single circuit, but the second one, as they say, didn't work. Because sarcophagi filled with blocks are nothing more than sealing the system, stopping production. And finally, where did the clay come from, which is everywhere there? Any Egyptologist knows that the Black Pyramid was made of clay. And this fact causes bewilderment in the scientific community. Clay would have fallen apart from rain and wind, and no vibration is needed, effort and time were wasted in vain. It turns out not in vain. Because there was no pyramid, it was not planned. There was a huge testing center. Not a separate unit, like in other pyramids, but a whole complex. Which had to be tested under load. And what is the easiest thing to make it from clay? So it all makes sense. We would have done exactly the same if we were in their place. It's time to move to the Giza Plateau. And I'll start with the Pyramid of Khafre. Because I believe that it was the first to be built on this plateau. And here's why. The Pyramid of Khafre has the simplest set of interior rooms of the Giza pyramids. And I would say simpler than the Dahshur pyramids, the red and the bent. There are only 2 chambers and they are for the first time deployed along the west-east axis. This means that they are oriented to the main vibration along the north-south axis. All this suggests that the main goal of the builders was to reduce vibration. And as they say, the result is obvious. Only the Pyramid of Khafre retained the cladding at the top. In this pyramid, as in all the previous ones, the condition for full filling of the system is preserved. The upper entrance is located high enough to easily fill all the interior rooms with water. But there is also a lower entrance. For what? For testing, of course. This is another example where the test unit has become part of the pyramid. I think that it included all the internal rooms, except for the upper descending corridor, laid out of granite. On what basis do I make such a conclusion? Pay attention to the level from which the lower entrance begins. This is the ground level. They could have started to break through it when the pyramid did not exist. This move was already used by the builders in the Mihdam pyramid. But unlike it, here they did not even cover it with a pyramid. They left it open to pump out water if necessary. Directly from the surface of the earth, spending a minimum of effort. If you draw this level further into the pyramid, you can see that it covers the upper horizontal corridor and comes out approximately to the middle of the height of the upper chamber. That is, even according to the logic of construction, first they laid out all these rooms, installed the sarcophagus in the chamber, and then continued to build the pyramid. This means that before construction, they could easily fill the entire system with water and test it. The point of the test was to make sure that the chamber with water would resonate with the frequency of the empty sarcophagus. And of course, at what amplitude the particulus would work. I will show the calculations at the end of the film. In the early 19th century, the Italian traveler Belzoni found the upper entrance to the pyramid. When he went down the descending corridor, he found a closed portcullis. It was lowered, but not completely. About 20 centimeters from the floor remained open. There are two options. Either when it was triggered, it could not immediately reach the floor. It simply got stuck, or it was raised after it was triggered. In any case, it was triggered. If the builders had manually lowered the portcullis to seal the passage, then of course they would have closed it completely, all the way. Most likely, the following happened. The portcullis was triggered by vibration. Then the water was pumped out through the lower corridor, and the portcullis was raised to make sure that the water was gone. When John Perring entered through the lower entrance and cleared the corridor, he saw the lower portcullis. It was open. It could not have been otherwise, when pumping out water from below. Logically, after testing this system in test mode without the upper corridor, the lower part of the part should have been closed. Otherwise, when filling through the upper entrance, water would have flowed from the lower one. But the builders did it easier. They closed the lower entrance and left the part of the part open. It was never closed. The lower part of the part was needed only as a prototype during testing, after which it was fixed in the open position. Therefore, when the upper part of the part was triggered and the upper corridor was cut off, it was enough to open the lower entrance to calmly pump out the water from the system. To do this, they lowered the sleeve into the lower horizontal corridor. By the way, many Egyptologists agree that there was water standing in the lower chamber for a long time, which fits perfectly with my version. The lower chamber is located below the horizontal corridor, and when pumping water from this level, the water remains in the lower chamber. Note how Belzoni found the upper chamber. The floor in the chamber was laid out with blocks so that the sarcophagus was recessed into it. Now this floor has been dismantled and several blocks remain around the sarcophagus. And then the sarcophagus, closed with a lid, was at the level of the floor and was part of it, which was an engineering solution transferred from the bent pyramid. Remember the highlighted empty space in the upper chamber? Called the empty box. This is further evidence that the Pyramid of Khafre was the first on the Giza Plateau. The next pyramid is that of Menkaure. In my opinion, the pyramids of Giza were built in this order: Khafre, Menkaure, and then Cheops. As usual, we note that the main entrance is located exactly where it is needed to completely fill all the interior rooms with water. But there is another corridor at the top leading to a dead end, which logically fits into my version. The builders once again used a prototype at the construction site, which was later built into the overall structure. The testing unit included an upper corridor, a large upper chamber, a lower horizontal corridor, and a room with portcullises. Here it is. The purpose of the tests was to establish at what amplitude of vibrations the portcullis would work. Note that in the Pyramid of Menkor, a mechanism of 4 portcullises and 3 round beams was used for the first time, which would later be used in the Pyramid of Cheops in front of the king's chamber. But let's get back to Menkor. The official version, according to which the upper corridor appeared as a result of the initial plan, according to which the pyramid was planned to be much smaller, is unlikely, to put it mildly. Look at what height from the floor, in the large chamber, is the entrance to the upper corridor. Moreover, the sequence of construction is beyond doubt. First, they punched the corridor and then made the chamber, the depth of which can only be explained by the planned lower corridor, and nothing else. Otherwise, all subsequent work, all the excavated rock would have to be raised to such a height. What kind of logic do you need to have to complicate your work so much? Of course not. Both the upper and lower corridors were planned at the same time. The upper one was needed for testing. Through it, they filled the large chamber, the lower horizontal corridor, and the room with the party scenes with water. To test this unit, based on the results, they determined the required frequency, and accordingly the size of the resonator chamber, and probably the pyramid as a whole, in order to understand at what angle to punch the main descending corridor. Of course, they first removed the water from the large chamber and the lower horizontal corridor. To do this, a special sleeve was lowered into the chamber through the upper entrance, or perhaps the same filling sleeve was turned on in reverse and lowered as the water was pumped out. Within the framework of this version, a slight slope of the horizontal corridor towards the chamber makes sense. It would seem like a trifle, but it beautifully confirms the version. However, it is not entirely clear how to remove the water from the lower rooms. Off the top of my head, there is only one option. The pumping sleeve was laid immediately and used as needed. It should be noted that there are 2 new rooms in this pyramid. This is the antechamber at the bottom of the descending corridor and an incomprehensible sash, let's call it that, in front of the lower chamber with the sarcophagus. It is gone now, but John Perring saw it and even took measurements. There is also a roughly punched passage to the ceiling of the lower chamber, but most likely it was punched out later. So, the antechamber at the end of the lower corridor with a characteristic pattern on the walls, similar to a wave signal delay line. It could have been intended for unloading the next room with the party scenes, to reduce the water pressure when filling the system and to prevent the activation of the portcullis. The lower room, reminiscent of a multi-armed vest, is a carbon copy of the middle level of the Osiris shaft. In my film How the Pyramids Worked, I assumed that these niches, facing in different directions, redirected the wave signal between the underground rooms of the Giza Plateau. But while I was preparing this film, I changed my mind. I realized that the builders of the pyramids did not have problems making the pyramids vibrate. On the contrary, there was a problem keeping the vibration within the permissible amplitude, saving the pyramids from destruction. Time after time they tried to solve this problem, adding various restraining elements. The pyramids in Dashur used resonator pairs in the form of identical chambers spaced apart on the sides, which balanced each other during vibration. There are no such pairs in the Pyramid of Menkor. Therefore, they used another unloading element. This vest, which is not oriented to the cardinal points, neither the middle nor the rays. Any waves were dampened in it. Therefore, I believe that it is a restraining element from excessive vibration. And finally, the Great Pyramid, also known as Cheops. You probably already understood why it is unique. The entrance to the pyramid is located significantly lower than the upper chamber, and it is impossible to fill this chamber with water through it. But this was not planned. The king's chamber is perfectly filled through shafts, which are mistakenly called air ducts. There are 2 of them, and both lead to the surface of the pyramid. This is a well-known fact. The chamber was filled with water through one, and the second is needed for the air to escape. In all other pyramids, the corridors were large enough for the air to escape through them. But here the shafts are narrow and a second one is needed to eliminate an airlock. Of course, this scheme only works if the particulars in front of the king's chamber were normally closed. It should be noted that in the Cheops pyramid, all three chambers are located along the west-east axis, which means that the main vibration is along the north-south axis. This is important because it was planned that the water level in the ascending corridor from the side of the large gallery would be such that when the pyramid vibrated, water would flow in small portions into the horizontal corridor. It was for this purpose that an experimental section was created, which is usually called a test corridor. The designers filled it with water and artificially created vibration through a vertical shaft to check how much the water would rise in the ascending corridor. What was this for? As Christopher Dunn showed, and I completely agree with him, hydrochloric acid and zinc hydrochloride flowed into the Queen's chamber through two shafts, which are called air ducts. Hydrochloric acid, when interacting with it, released hydrogen, which exited through a horizontal passage into the large gallery. There, due to wave dynamics, it accelerated, but that's not what we're talking about now. Now I want to focus on the water. As I already said, the water was supposed to flow from the ascending corridor. Exactly flow, and not flood the Queen's chamber. Otherwise, the proportions would be violated and the water would simply extinguish the reaction. So what was the water for? I think to extinguish the waste. Apparently, after the reaction, they still represented an aggressive environment, which had to be extinguished with water. Water from the ascending corridor, when vibrating, entered the horizontal corridor, extinguished the aggressive mixture and drained into the well, which is located immediately after the ascending corridor in the right corner, at the very bottom of the large gallery. They are separated by a small threshold, which did not allow the waste to flow into the ascending corridor. Egyptologists call this drain well an evacuation passage. It was dug specifically to drain chemical waste after the reaction. But it was not completely cut through to the lower chamber as it is now, but ended in a grotto, which today is in the middle of the passage. As you can see at the exit from the Queen's chamber, at the beginning of the horizontal corridor there is a step, 40 centimeters high. Together with the Queen's chamber, it creates a certain capacity in which the reaction took place. When this tank was filled, the waste flowed further into the horizontal corridor, was extinguished with water and flowed into the drain well. An emergency drain was also provided in case the working level in the Queen's chamber was exceeded. This niche to the left of the entrance to the chamber was needed as insurance against overflow. It is located at a height of slightly less than a meter, but obviously higher than the step in the horizontal corridor. I give the dimensions so that it is clear that this niche did not interfere with the work process. But still, it came in handy. Because exactly under it, in the descending corridor in front of the lower chamber, there is such a trace. Perhaps this is the waste drain from the Queen's chamber through this niche. This means that overflow did happen, at least once. Apparently, during the work, the pyramid gained such an amplitude of vibrations that was not provided for at the testing stage and water began to flood the Queen's chamber. As a result, the reaction of hydrogen release weakened or stopped completely. It was necessary to correct the situation. Probably, the drain well together with the grotto quickly filled up. Surely its size was designed based on the expected volume of waste. But, everything did not go according to plan. The volume of water coming from the ascending corridor turned out to be much larger than planned. And the builders chose the only possible option, in my opinion. They dug a drain well to the descending corridor, almost to the lower chamber, and blocked the water access to the ascending corridor. With the help of a stone plug, the purpose of which has puzzled hundreds of researchers. And within the framework of this version, the meaning of the stone plug becomes simple and clear. Of course, before these works, the water was removed from the pyramid. What did the builders achieve with such an upgrade? According to the rule of connecting vessels, the water entered the drain well through the descending corridor and rose to the level of the main entrance, i.e. approximately to this point. The chemical mixture from the Queen's chamber began to flow out to the drain well and drain into it. Thus, the waste began to be extinguished already in the well. Due to the small width and vertical location, the water in the well did not change its level and did not splash out when the pyramid vibrated. But another reason for the flooding of the Queen's chamber and the drain well is possible. which came from above, from the king's chamber. According to my version, the king's chamber was closed by the portcullis system in working mode. And in an emergency, it opened and the water drained through a large gallery into a drain well. How did this happen? How did the portcullis mechanism work? For this, at least one portcullis had to be lowered and completely block the passage. It is logical to assume that this was the first portcullis from the side of the chamber. Firstly, in this case, water does not enter the antechamber and does not fill the portcullis system. And secondly, look at what the southern wall of the antechamber looks like. The one that is closer to the king's chamber. See these grooves? The counterpart was probably on the portcullis, which moved along them. This provides greater tightness between the portcullis and the wall. Therefore, most likely, it was the portcullis closest to the chamber that blocked the passage. The rest worked as counterweights when triggered. The reconstruction shows that above 3 of the 4 portcullises, there were round beams to which they were attached. That is, how the counterweights worked is clear. When some mechanism was triggered, they went down, lifting the locking portcullis up. But they did not go all the way down, but stopped at the same level as the first one. At this height. Freely releasing water from the king's chamber. It remains to determine the mechanism that held the counterweights in working mode and released them in emergency mode. Look at this photo. This is the opposite portcullis, the first one from the side of the large gallery. The arrow indicates a small niche above it. The counterpart can be on the portcullis itself from the end. In the fixed position, this mechanism holds the portcullis. And with excessive vibration, or some one-time mechanical impulse, the lock comes out of the groove and the portcullis goes down under its own weight. It is still in the lowered position. This is indicated by the entire lower edge. Together with it, 2 other counterweights go down, and the last locking one rises. An emergency drain of water from the king's chamber could have caused the instant filling of the drain well with the grotto. You can see that the volume of the king's chamber exceeds their total volume. Excess water splashed out through the main entrance. This was a signal for the operators that the part stages of the upper chamber worked. And finally, the reason why it worked. There are traces of repair work on the ceiling of the king's chamber. Christopher Dunn explains this in his book by a hydrogen explosion inside the chamber. The explosion was so strong that the granite walls moved apart and the ceilings rose, he writes. I have a different version. It was a water hammer. Any closed space filled with liquid cannot withstand an increase in the volume of this liquid. Of course, unless the walls are made of a plastic material. The granite walls of the king's chamber are not such a material. Why did the water or water solution that filled the king's chamber increase its volume? Because it was heating up. And why was it heating up? Because even salted water becomes an electrolyte, and a solution with hydrochloric acid makes it a strong electrolyte. If they used hydrochloric acid in the queen's chamber, why couldn't they use it in the king's chamber? When vibrating, the granite blocks generated a divided charge on their sides. And an alternating charge. When vibrating in one direction or another, the signs of the charges changed. Now let's add an electrolyte inside such a generator, and we get a generator and a battery. 2 in 1. And since the current generated is alternating, then when vibrating, the entire volume inside the chamber begins to heat up. Hence the black color of the walls in the chamber. A question immediately arises. Didn't the builders foresee this heating and so easily set themselves up? It looks like they did. Don't forget about the so-called air ducts that come out of the king's chamber, on the north and south sides. As I already said, the king's chamber was filled through them. It looks like they first filled it with water, and then sent in the required amount of acid. And the second was needed so that the air could come out when the chamber was filled and so that there was room for the liquid to expand when heated. Or rather, it expanded in both directions, of course. Everything was foreseen. So why did the water hammer happen? The first thing that comes to mind is that both shafts leading from the king's chamber were blocked. Due to excessive vibration, or on purpose? Maybe so. They were at war, too. As a result of the blow, the party curtains were triggered, water came out of the upper chamber, filled the well with the grotto, partially flooded the queen's chamber and splashed out of the main entrance. After which the builders punched a drain well to the lower chamber, closed the ascending corridor with a stone plug and repaired the king's chamber. A couple more interesting details in favor of this version. There is information that Al-Mamun's people, who were the first to penetrate the Cheops pyramid in the 9th century, found a large amount of white powder in the king's chamber. Perhaps it was chlorine powder, the result of long-term use of a hydrochloric acid solution as an electrolyte. And all the surfaces of the queen's chamber were covered with salt crystals, a layer of 1 centimeter. Crystallization of salt on surfaces is the result of a chemical reaction involving hydrochloric acid. This is where the information part ends. It remains only to show some calculations that I talked about at the beginning of the film. We will talk about the correlation between the master sarcophagi and resonator chambers. Of course, in those pyramids where they are. Actually, from the set that I analyzed above, sarcophagi were installed only in 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. To this day, they have been preserved in the pyramids of Cheops and Khafre. The basalt sarcophagus from the Pyramid of Menkaure, unfortunately sank in the Mediterranean Sea during its transportation to England. But its dimensions have been preserved. I'll start with Khafre. The internal dimensions of the sarcophagus in centimeters are 215 by 68. The main axis of vibration in the chamber is north-south. The sarcophagus is located along this axis, which means we are interested in the length of the sarcophagus. It is equal to half the wavelength. All resonators are calculated this way. This size should set the reference frequency of wave oscillations. Let's calculate it. The speed of propagation of an elastic wave in the air is 330 meters per second, divided by the wavelength of 4 meters 30 centimeters. We get the resonant frequency of the sarcophagus 77 Hz. Now the same with the chamber. The width of 5 meters is half a wave, which means 10 meters is a whole. First, we calculate the resonant frequency in the air. The speed of 330 divided by 10, we get 33 Hz. We try to somehow combine it with the frequency of the sarcophagus, and nothing works. Now we fill the chamber with water. That is, we change the air environment to water. The speed of an elastic wave in water is 1.5 kilometers per second. We divide the speed by the wavelength, we get 150 Hz. And this is almost an exact hit in the second harmonic from the sarcophagus frequency. And I took the rounded size of the chamber width. And if we take the exact one, then Flinders Petrie showed 4 meters 97 centimeters, and Weiss and Paring 4.93 meters. If we take this figure, then the frequency of the chamber comes out to 152 Hz. Even closer to the standard. And this means that the chamber in the Pyramid of Khafre, filled with water, resonated with the empty sarcophagus at the second harmonic. That is, in the best harmonic combination. Next is Cheops. The dimensions of the sarcophagus are 1 meter and 98 centimeters by 67 centimeters. Vibration along the north-south axis. The sarcophagus is located along this axis. In general, everything is like in Khafre. 1.98 meters is half the wavelength, so 3.96 is a whole. We divide the speed in the air by the wavelength, we get 83 Hz. Now we calculate the chamber. The width of 5.2 meters is exactly 10 cubits, there are no discrepancies here. The wavelength is 10.40 meters. First, we calculate in the air. We divide the speed by the length, we get 32 Hz. No combination with the frequency of the sarcophagus. Now we calculate in water. We divide 1500 by the wavelength of 10.4, we get 144 Hz. We compare it with the frequency of the sarcophagus, somehow not very good. And now I will take the external length of the sarcophagus, 2.3 meters. The wavelength becomes 4.6. We calculate the frequency, 330 speed in the air divided by 4.6 and get 72 Hz. We take the second harmonic, i.e. multiply by 2, and get 144. Bingo! Absolutely hit the resonant frequency of the chamber with water. Don't even ask why there is a correlation with the external dimensions of the sarcophagus. I don't know. Well, and Menkaure. The chamber with the sarcophagus is located along the north-south axis, which means the main vibration is along the west-east axis. The sarcophagus stood across this axis, which means the width of the sarcophagus is needed for the calculations. It is 62 centimeters. This means the wavelength is 1.24 meters. Divide the speed in the air by the wavelength, we get 266 Hz, the resonant frequency of the sarcophagus by width. Now the chamber. Width 2.62. Multiply by 2, we get a wavelength of 5.24. The speed in water is 1,500 meters per second divided by 5.24 is equal to 286 Hz, compare with the frequency of the sarcophagus. Of course, there is no such hit as in Cheops and Kauffer, but the error is within 10%. Look. I don't even want to show the calculation with the air in the chamber, there is nothing nearby. Well, let's sum it up. Of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau, when filled with water, 2 showed an exact hit in resonance between the sarcophagus and the chamber, and the third hit with a small error. In addition, many inexplicable details of the interior of the pyramids became clear and logical. I even wanted to put these details in one row at the end of the film. But I changed my mind. It already turned out to be longer than planned. And those who watched and listened carefully do not need to list them again. Well, and those who missed it will have a reason to watch it again. In general, that's all. Although no, I forgot to say the main thing. To start the pyramids again, you just need to. Well, in general, you get the idea.